For listeners who are not familiar with Filipino cuisine, can you run us through, something about Filipino cuisine? What are your go-to dishes, and what are some of the most common ingredients in the cuisine?
Oh man, it's always when people ask me like, oh, like what are like the flavors of Filipino food? And it's like it's really tough,
Yeah.
for multiple reasons. Like let's get to it, but like I mean, food is political, right? Like food is the way, like it's culture, it's your history, and sadly, the Philippines has a history of colonization, multiple times of colonization, right? So a lot of our food is Spanish influenced.
Mm.
Why? Because over 300 years of that, there are some dishes that we have because of the U.S. occupation and the Japanese occupation, right? Halo halo. Um, I mean, I don't like 100%, like I'm not a food historian, but things that I've read, like I know for sure the fact that we rely on canned goods so much is very much part of like the US Army occupation. So like the fact that like a lot of our things, like we love like spam, right? Corned beef, Vienna sausages. That's something that like the Philippines and Puerto Rico like very much share because of like the similar like army occupation. A lot of our desserts use like condensed milk and evaporated milk, right? Canned goods that are shelf stable in that kind of a heat. Halo halo, supposedly, I'm not sure if this is true, is kind of like a mix between like in the wartime, like Japanese kakigori, which is the shaved ice, and then like the American like canned goods because it usually uses evaporated milk, and then like the Filipino preserved like sweet fruits and beans and things that we use, like the red bean, the coconut, the makapuno, and stuff like that. So it's hard to talk about our food without being like we were colonized. So there's like a lot of different influences. China is right there, which is a major trade route. It's Southeast Asia. So it's an archipelago of like over 7,000 islands. It's a very long country. So it's like where in the Philippines, right? Where you live changes the kind of food that you eat, right? If you're further south, like the more like Mindanao, it's more of what you think of as typical Southeast Asian, right? A lot of like coconut milk based things, a little bit spicier. My sister-in-law is from like a Bicol, so that like there are like some spicy things from there. My family is Tagalog, like we're so like we have like I don't know what you think of like typical stuff. Like our adobo is, with vinegar, garlic, soy sauce, bay leaf. But that's not the only kind of adobo. There's multiple kinds of adobo, and it varies from household to household, from region to region. So that really is a very tough thing to quantify, like in a simple way. You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
where are you from? How did you grow up? At what era did you grow up? It's that kind of a thing.
Yeah,
Like the
exactly.
food that my mom grew up eating in the Philippines when she lived there is not the food that is necessarily being eaten in the Philippines now, right? Because it's also a weird like time machine, which is kind of like what I do with the Lola Flor character. Like it's the food that and the country that you knew is not the same place anymore, right? Like my mom left when she was 12, right? It's a very different place now in many different ways, and that includes the food. There are things that when she goes back, she's like, it doesn't exist anymore. Or like it does, but it's changed in such a way. She was like, oh, but that's not like, oh, that's not how they make it anymore. This is how we have it. And she's like, like, so it's really hard to talk like availability, things like that.
And yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, in essence, Filipino cuisine is quite like halo halo. It's like literally mix, right? And
Yeah, part of it, like I mentioned in my first book, Arsenic No, the ideas of like what is authentic, and the idea of like authenticity being a gatekeeper in some ways, and and being closed minded because like, you mentioned like what I ate growing up, right? So like my grandparents and parents, immigrated to the US in the 70s and the 80s. And, my father and my grandparents were still cooking Filipino food, but obviously they didn't have access to the kinds of, ingredients they would have gotten back there. So like, was my father's, beefsteak and buns like inauthentic because we used lemon instead of calamansi? Like, well, we didn't have access to calamansi, that we use this particular fish instead of that fish that you're supposed to use. Well, that fish doesn't exist, or it didn't at the time exist in Chicago in the 80s, Um, and so diaspora cuisine is kind of its own thing. And so I think because there's this part where it's just like, are you like respecting what it is while still trying it and try and innovate in different ways? Because there are also people who are like, oh, we need to elevate it as if like there's something wrong with it. Like that way she's putting like gummy bears in your halo halo, and I'm like, oh, like that just ruins things texturally, you know what I mean? um or are you like thinking on the various possibilities of like, this is what's at the heart of it, this is what it could be, this is my take on it, and I think that's really fascinating. My
Mm-hmm.
mom, me and my mom have like my mom is very kind of old school about it. We know not to take her anymore to the more expensive upscale Filipino eateries in Chicago. She just wants that home cooking.
Mm.
She like that. She's that Lola Flora. She's like, this is how it's supposed to taste. This is how it's always tasted. That's what I want. Wait, how much is it? Oh, absolutely not. Like, so she's um so that's like an ongoing conversation of, because it's also because like there's this weird thing of like what people are willing to pay for our
Mm.
cuisine, right? Because people are willing to pay premium for like French cuisine, and it's gotten to a point like people are willing to pay premium for like sushi and other like ideas of like global elevated things, but the idea of paying for like um like people get like incensed at like the price of tacos, as if like Mexican food does not deserve a certain, that it doesn't come with a certain level of expertise, and or like Chinese food. Like if we go to like a Chinese joint and you're like, oh, you're charging me how much for these dumplings, and it's just like, well, do you know how much work goes into them? Like, do you know what the price of food is right now? um so I think there's also a little bit of that where
Yeah.
people have in their minds like, no, this is a cheap cuisine, you're not supposed to be charging these prices. Because there's this amazing, well, there was, she's passed, Doreen Fernandez. She was a Filipino food writer, and so like her question was like the question is like, I'm paraphrasing, like the question isn't what is Filipino food, but how does a food become Filipino?
Mm.
And it goes into the thing of colonization, right? Like, it's like banana ketchup, right? So you that like how is spam and other things like that, like they don't come, Filipino spaghetti, like those things were not inherently Filipino, but they came to the Philippines and became Filipino for various reasons. And I think it also works that way in the US, right? Like it's
Mm-hmm.
sometimes out of necessity, right? Again, like those didn't exist at that time, or just out of innovation. Um, so again, like I'm not like talking around your question. It is something that I've engaged with all the time. But that's my favorite quote to
Right.
use when people ask me what is Filipino food. It's that. How does it
Mm-hmm.
become Filipino and why?
That's you raised really good points, because it's like first you raised the point that sometimes like someone's authentic is not someone else's authentic, and like in a sense it's like context matters, right? Because maybe sometimes like they can't do it in like a traditional authentic way because they just didn't have access to that ingredient, they had to like improvise. And at the same time it's like you mentioned like that bias about some Asian cuisines, especially Southeast Asian cuisines, are supposed to be cheap, which was kind of highlighted in like our Proudly Asian Foods Month last year as well, where this like Burmese restaurant owner would always get questions about like, oh, shouldn't Burmese food be cheap? Like, why am I paying this much? But then he raised a really good point in the sense of like, if you're willing to pay this much for a hamburger, why wouldn't you be willing to pay this much for like Burmese food, right?
Yeah, like you're gonna go to a pub and pay like $15-$20 for a burger and fries, but
Exactly.
like
Yeah.
this, no, is too much.